On June 30th, 1908, at 7:14 in the morning, approximately 80 million trees fell simultaneously across an area larger than the state of Connecticut. The explosion released energy equivalent to 2,000 Hiroshima bombs. No crater was ever found. But there is something that disappeared from official records the moment it became inconvenient. In 1912, a telegraph operator named Innocenty Alexeyev, working at a remote station 340 miles south of the impact zone, submitted a detailed log of electromagnetic disturbances he had received on his equipment during the moments before and after the explosion. That log was marked classified by the Russian Imperial Ministry. It was never published. It was never explained, and within weeks of submitting it, Alexeyev was transferred to a station so isolated that his communications with other operators effectively ceased. What he heard on those telegraph lines, and why the Russian government decided that record needed to vanish, is a question that has never been adequately resolved. The official explanation for the Tunguska event settled quickly. In 1927, when the first serious expedition reached the impact zone, Soviet scientists concluded that a meteorite had struck. The energy release was enormous. The object itself had either vaporized in the atmosphere or buried itself so completely that it could never be found. This explanation satisfied the international scientific community. Textbooks were written. The matter was considered closed. But the telegraph log created a problem for that narrative. Alexeyev had recorded something systematic. Not random electromagnetic noise, not the chaotic signal surge you would expect from a meteorite impact. Instead, he documented what he described in his initial report as intelligible pulsing patterns with mathematical regularity, beginning at 7:09 and ceasing at 7:31. That is 22 minutes of patterned electromagnetic transmission recorded on equipment designed to detect telegraph signals across the Siberian frontier. He noted that the disturbance interfered with normal telegraph operations and that it displayed what he called deliberate modulation. Read that word again. Deliberate, not accidental, not debris, not natural discharge, deliberate modulation. The relevant section of Alexeyev's log was photographed in 1920 by a Swedish researcher named Gustaf Hertzsprung, who was interviewing Siberian telegraph operators for a survey on communication reliability in remote regions. Hertzsprung's personal archive, now held at the Swedish National Archives in Stockholm, contains photographic plates of portions of Alexeyev's original documentation. The plates are faded but readable. In Alexeyev's own handwriting, made in real time during the event, are notations indicating signal frequency, intensity measurements made against comparison marks on his equipment, and marginal notes describing what he observed. In one margin, dated June 30th, 1908, appears the phrase pattern suggests artificial origin awaiting clarification. Beneath that, in a different hand, someone has written classified return immediately. The handwriting analysts who examined these plates in the 1970s concluded that the second notation was made by someone with official authority and added after Alexeyev's original entries. The plates themselves remained largely unknown to Western researchers until a Swedish documentary filmmaker named Erik Blomqvist located them in the National Archives in 1989. When Blomqvist attempted to contact the Russian Academy of Sciences to request access to the original telegraph logs, he was informed that the documents had been misplaced during the Cold War reorganization of records. No further clarification was provided. Consider the timeline carefully. 1908, the event occurs. Alexeyev records systematic electromagnetic patterns that troubled him enough to flag them as potentially artificial in origin. 1912, 4 years later, with no public attention to his log, his observations are marked classified by the Russian ministry, and he is transferred. 1917, the Russian imperial government collapses. the Bolsheviks take control. During the subsequent 2 decades of chaos, most imperial-era records either are destroyed or end up in various undocumented locations. 1927, the first major scientific expedition reaches Tunguska. Their findings are published. The meteorite explanation becomes standard. 1937, during Stalin's purges, massive numbers of scientific personnel are arrested and disappeared. This includes several researchers who had conducted early Tunguska investigations. 1945, the Cold War begins. By 1946, Soviet research into the Tunguska event becomes classified as a matter of state security. Why would a natural meteorite impact become a security concern? Why would telegraph logs from an event that occurred in 1908 still matter to the Soviet state in 1946, decades after the impact itself? Unless what fell was not what the official explanation claimed it was. In 1959, a Soviet scientist named Leonid Kulik, who had led the 1927 expedition and spent decades studying Tunguska, made a statement during a restricted internal presentation that survives in declassified Soviet archives. Kulik stated that the impact zone contained evidence of regularity inconsistent with meteoritic collision. He noted that the tree fall pattern, rather than radiating from a single epicenter as would be expected from a meteor strike, displayed what he called geometric organization. Trees did not fall randomly, they fell in patterns. Sections of the forest remained completely undisturbed, creating zones of preserved timber within the devastation. Kulik theorized that whatever struck Tunguska may have decelerated significantly before impact, which would explain both the unusual electromagnetic disturbances recorded by Alexeyev and the peculiar forest fall pattern. A meteor hitting at terminal velocity should produce a single radial burst of destruction. What Kulik found suggested something that had slowed its approach, something that had actively modulated its descent. His presentation was never published. Kulik died in 1941, officially from heart failure, though records of his death are sparse. The theory he proposed was filed away and effectively suppressed for the next 40 years. In 1908, the technology available to telegraph operators was relatively simple but well understood. Alexeyev's equipment was a standard Morse telegraph receiver, modified with a sensitive galvanometer designed to detect the small electrical fluctuations transmitted across the vast distances of the Siberian network. When a distant operator keyed a telegraph switch, the resulting electrical pulse travelled along copper wire and caused a deflection on Alexeyev's equipment that he could read and interpret. The equipment was not sensitive enough to detect random electromagnetic noise from the environment. It was specifically tuned to telegraph frequencies. If Alexeyev recorded a signal, that signal was either transmitted intentionally through telegraph lines, or it was an electromagnetic phenomenon powerful enough to induce current in his equipment without being transmitted through the wires. A natural meteorite impact would produce electromagnetic radiation, but it would not be organized. It would not display mathematical regularity. The distinction between noise and signal is precision. Alexeyev recorded signal. Multiple telegraph operators across Siberia recorded disturbances that morning, but only Alexeyev documented them in detail. 2 other operators at stations to the east reported electrical interference that disrupted their equipment for approximately 20 minutes. Neither kept precise records of the pattern. Neither was interviewed systematically about what they observed. Both retired from service within 2 years and left Siberia. Their names appear in personnel records, but nowhere else. Finding their accounts, if they still exist, would require access to Russian telegraph company archives that have never been opened to independent researchers. What happened next established a pattern that would repeat throughout the 20th century whenever evidence about Tunguska became inconvenient. In 1961, 4 years after Kulik's suppressed presentation, A Soviet expedition led by Yevgeny Krinov returned to the impact zone with improved instruments. They collected soil samples, conducted electromagnetic surveys, and documented the forest fall pattern with precision that had not been possible in earlier expeditions. Their findings were remarkable. The soil at the impact center contained magnetic particles in concentrations far higher than the surrounding forest. The distribution of these particles was not random. They formed a geometric pattern suggesting that whatever struck had been conducting electromagnetic energy at the moment of impact. In 1963, Krinov submitted a paper describing these findings to the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The paper was rejected for publication. Krinov was informed that his findings required further verification and that publication was premature. He spent the next year attempting to gather additional data to strengthen his conclusions. In 1964, Soviet authorities informed him that all future Tunguska expeditions required advance approval from the Ministry of Defense. The theoretical reason given was that the region was strategically sensitive and close to Chinese territory. The practical effect was that independent research in the impact zone became impossible. Krinov never returned. He published no further work on Tunguska. He died in 1980, having spent the last decades of his life studying meteor craters in Central Asia. His Tunguska materials were sealed in the Academy archives. They were not declassified until 1992, more than a decade after his death. The room exists. Room might be the wrong word. It is the archival vault beneath the main building of the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. It contains the restricted materials of 20th century Soviet research, released gradually and incompletely since the Soviet collapse. Researchers with proper credentials can view certain documents for limited periods. The complete Alexeyev telegraph logs are housed there, not in partial photographic form, but as original documents. The original pages show not just the notations visible in the Swedish photographs, but additional details that the photographs did not capture clearly. What is visible in the original logs, according to 3 separate researchers who have been granted access in recent years, is that Alexeyev recorded not only the patterns, but also attempted to interpret them. In margins throughout his log, he wrote what can only be described as speculative notes about what source could produce such signals. In one entry, made during the signal reception itself, he wrote, "Frequency consistent with human transmission impossible due to distance, unless origin is airborne." In another entry, hours later after the signal ceased, he wrote, "Request verification from Moscow, received what appears to be modulated signal from airspace above Tunguska region at time of reported explosion." These original notations are not visible in the Swedish photographs, because the photographs were taken at an angle that did not capture the marginal writing clearly. This means that the full extent of what Alexeyev documented and concluded about the nature of what he had recorded remained hidden even from the Western researchers who thought they had found the suppressed evidence. The physical evidence still exists in the impact zone itself. The fallen trees remain largely undisturbed because the region is so remote that industrial logging operations never reached it extensively. In 1994, a joint Russian-American expedition conducted a detailed survey of the forest fall pattern using satellite imagery and GPS technology that would have been impossible even a decade earlier. The analysis revealed something extraordinary. The trees had not fallen randomly, they had fallen in sectors. Some areas showed trees all pointing in the same direction, consistent with a blast wave radiating from a single point. Other areas showed trees oriented in different directions, suggesting multiple pressure waves hitting from different angles. The researchers concluded that the pattern was most consistent with the impact of an object that approached from a specific angle, decelerated significantly during the approach, and impact with force distributed across multiple points of contact rather than concentrated at a single impact crater. This is not how meteorites impact. Meteorites approach from above at terminal velocity. They do not decelerate progressively. They do not make multiple points of contact before hitting. They do not leave forests with trees fallen in an organized geometric pattern. The 1994 expedition findings were published in a peer-reviewed journal. The paper received almost no media attention. It did not fit the established narrative. Therefore, it was allowed to exist in the literature without being integrated into the Tunguska consensus. Ask a scientist today what caused Tunguska, and they will tell you a meteorite. Show them the forest fall pattern data, and they will offer various explanations for how meteoritic impact could theoretically produce such patterns. The data does not disprove the meteorite explanation. It simply makes that explanation inadequate to account for all observations. In 1998, the Russian government released certain declassified materials from the Soviet Academy archives. Among these materials was a document titled Memorandum Regarding Restrictions on Tunguska Research, dated April 1946. The document was signed by officials in the Kremlin and addressed to the Academy of Sciences. The memorandum stated that all research involving the Tunguska impact zone was henceforward to be conducted under military oversight. The stated reason was preservation of state security. No further clarification was provided in the document itself. However, attached to the memorandum were handwritten notes, apparently from the Academy Secretary at that time, indicating that military officials had expressed concern about patterns in the impact zone that suggested the event was not of natural origin. This is an official Soviet government document acknowledging, in 1946, that evidence existed suggesting Tunguska was not caused by a meteorite. That document remained classified until 1998. No major Western news organization reported its release. It is referenced in a handful of scientific papers focused on archival research. It has never been discussed seriously in mainstream accounts of the Tunguska event. The intellectual infrastructure to accommodate it did not exist then and does not exist now. We do not have a framework for discussing the possibility that something came down from the sky in 1908 with apparent intention in its descent. Our science accommodates accidents. Our history accommodates natural disasters. But something that descended with modulation and geometric precision occupies a category that our institutions have no language for. Alexeyev lived for another 36 years after his transfer in 1912. He worked at increasingly remote telegraph stations in central Siberia until his retirement in 1938. He never spoke publicly about what he had recorded. Letters that survive from colleagues indicate he was cautious in his personal correspondence about the subject, writing in veiled language if the topic arose. In 1941, when the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union began, Alexeyev, though retired, was recalled to service to help manage communications in the far eastern territories. He worked in Vladivostok until 1945. When he retired the second time, at age 73, he lived quietly until his death in 1948. He left no personal testimony about the event, no diary explaining his experiences, no deathbed statement clarifying what he had received on his equipment that morning in 1908. He took the details with him. Everything we know about what he recorded and concluded comes from official logs and from the brief notations that survived in the Swedish photograph archive. That silence itself is significant. A man who had experienced something extraordinary and been silenced by his government did not resist. He did not attempt to publish his account. He did not flee to speak to Western researchers. He accepted the classification of his observations and lived the remainder of his life without publicly discussing them. What is the nature of evidence that compels a man to remain silent? Even decades after the government that silenced him has changed, what must he have believed he had recorded to accept that silence? The door to the Tunguska Event remains closed. The trees fell. The explosion occurred. The signal was transmitted or received. The logs were classified. The researchers were restricted. The patterns were documented and then set aside. The official story was established and has persisted because it requires no explanation beyond itself. A meteorite fell. That is a complete narrative. Anything else demands further explanation. Anything else raises questions that create cascading uncertainties. Science prefers the simpler explanation. History prefers the simpler narrative. But Alexeyev recorded something that morning. Something unusual enough that he marked it for clarification from Moscow. Something that remains in the archives beneath St. Petersburg, visible to anyone with authorization, but integrated into no official account. The signal was real. The modulation was patterned. The source was never identified. What fell at Tunguska in 1908 decelerated before impact, left no visible crater, and announced its arrival through telegraph wires 340 miles away with a message in electromagnetic language that no human at the time could translate. And we are still waiting for someone to explain what that message said.